I'm going to talk about sharing our world. Why am I talking about sharing our world? Because the resources and the sinks on this earth are quite limited, and this requires recognizing those limits and sharing those resources. So basically, in my presentation, I'm going to focus on the fact that we live on an unhealthy planet right now, and this is causing poor health for people, it's affecting their well-being, and most of this is caused by injustice and inequality. I think one of the key elements of a proposed solution has to be a just approach, and I'm going to focus on what's called just boundaries, just foundations, and just transformation. Then I'm going to narrow in onto the topic of climate change and look at the climate injustices. I'm also going to make a proposal on climate justice and end off with a little story about why we desperately need a global constitution. So, if you look at the planet today, the environmental problems that we are facing today affect more than 25% of death and morbidity, whether it's air pollution killing 7 million people or heat affecting more than 70 million people, whether we are talking about water pollution or we're talking about biodiversity loss. As you probably know, biodiversity loss can lead to zoonotic disease, and zoonotic disease is 60% of all infectious disease. And of course, people are being displaced, and more people are displaced by environmental issues than by war. And in total, the land degradation worldwide affects 3.2 billion people. These are some of the statistics that came out of the Global Environment Outlook 2019. Now, if this is the case, what we are seeing is that the environment is absolutely essential for us. And who is getting hurt? On this graph, on the left side of the x-axis, you see the privileged, and on the right side, the marginalized, and you can see vulnerability on the y-axis. And basically, you will find that it is almost always the most vulnerable people, whether they are disabled or not, they are the most vulnerable to the impacts of the environmental issues. But if you then look at the data on who causes the problems, it is sometimes completely reverse. The richer you are, the more likely that you use more goods and services, the more likely you have a pension that is invested in a lot of other products, the more likely you have savings in a bank, and the more likely that you have your own luxury yacht on which you are spending a huge amount of fossil fuels. So essentially what you see is that the rich are not necessarily the people who are at the front line of being affected, which is why also they are less motivated to take action on a range of environmental issues, including climate change. And that is why I think we need to come towards a much more just approach to looking at this world. So here, in looking at the concept of Earth system justice, what we did was we looked at the scholarship from local contextual to global universal, and from conservative incremental to ideal transformative. Now, generally speaking, conservative and incremental justice just tries to improve routines. Whereas if you're on the ideal transformative side, you're trying to actually change the system, whether it is the financial system or the political system. You're really trying to address the driving causes of inequality and environmental injustice. So my gut feeling says that we need to be on the right side, the green area, and we need to have a continuous iteration between local and global to understand what is the kind of justice we need. So, going through a massive expert interrogation process as well as a literature review, we finally conceptualized justice and operationalized it. In the conceptualization, we said not only does it have to be transformative or ideal, it has to be based on recognition justice, which is looking at those people who normally do not get prioritized, and looking at those knowledges that do not normally get prioritized. That's epistemic justice. Then we need to look at interspecies, intergenerational, and intragenerational justice. And we need to balance between the three. And of course, procedural and substantive justice. So how do we then operationalize this? We look at ends and means. Ends looks at the boundaries of the system. So what is an appropriate boundary to the use of resources and sinks? What amount of the resources and sinks must be reserved for the poorest on the earth? And then we look at the means. And the means are looking at how do we address the underlying causes of environmental injustice and inequality? How do we allocate liability for harm caused? How do we allocate remaining resources and responsibilities? So put another way, I'm going back to sharing our earth. If you have resources, what is the safe boundary? And then, is the safe boundary just? That means if you keep that boundary, do you prevent significant harm to people as well as other species? In the inner core is, can you meet the minimum needs of people worldwide within those boundaries? And then the remaining questions are, how do we allocate the remaining resources? Who is affected by the problem? How do we allocate the responsibilities? And of course, how do we address the driving forces? All right. Now I'm going to give you the results. This is an interdisciplinary project together with Johan Rockstrom of the Earth Commission. And basically what you do is you look at various domains. So here, for example, climate, surface water, groundwater, but I can go on. And then the natural scientists came up with what they felt was a safe boundary to protect these resources. For example, for climate change, the boundary proposed by them is 1.5 degrees centigrade, because beyond 1.5, you can trigger all kinds of tipping points, which makes the system completely irreversible. The question now is 1.5 just? So based on a lot of our research, we finally came up with the conclusion that actually 1 degree centigrade is a much more just target. And this is because already at 1 degree centigrade, tens of millions of people are exposed to extreme heat, which we call wet bulb temperature. So high heat and high humidity. And if you're exposed to that for a day or so, you can even die from it. So it is extremely damaging. And we looked at a range of different impacts. We looked at the IPCC reports, and we tried to say how much damage, how many people should die before we say that a problem is serious. Now, the Earth Commission did not dare to come up with a number. So that is one of the reasons why you will find that our numbers of acceptable harm differ across the different domains. But anyway, we proposed 1 degree centigrade, and we presented that to the World Economic Forum as well as in our Nature paper. Now, for the other areas, we think that safe is equal to just, except for aerosol pollution and nitrogen. And aerosol pollution has a much more stringent just boundary because you're exposed to air pollution within this 1 cubic meter, and there we use the World Health Organization standards. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the story is, what is that just boundary? Now, once you have a just boundary, you are only allowed to use that much resource or that much sinks. I hope you're still with me. Where are we today? We are the little earth ball, and you can see that the ball is outside the safe and just boundary for all the domains. It's also outside the domain of the aerosol pollution, except that aerosol pollution is a much more local issue, so we have dealt with it slightly differently. And this basically means that the world as a whole has to go on a diet in our use of resources and sinks. Now, when I was looking at the world having crossed these boundaries, this map shows you where more than 2 boundaries have been crossed. The darker the red, almost all 7 boundaries have been crossed. But as you can see, there are very few areas in the world that are white where no boundary is crossed. So this is also from a justice perspective. You're moving away from a total number to try to show the spatial component. So this affects all of us. So this is the question of having a just boundary to the use of resources. Now, We are outside the boundary, but we have not yet met minimum needs. So the next question is, what would happen if we were to meet the minimum needs of all people worldwide? So we took a human rights perspective and we had two levels, dignity being the very lowest and escape from poverty a little higher. And we only took 4 elements here: access to water, food, energy, and a small house the size of a parking lot, and a little bit of transport. In the next iteration, we will also look at clothing, and we will look at communication, primary healthcare, and primary education. And then you look at, if you were to provide people the water they need for their food, the water they need for their drinking, the water they need for their energy, etc., what would be the pressure of the environment? And then our natural science friends did the calculations for us. And basically, this is how our results come out. So the blue area shows you what is the current pressure on the earth, where many people do not have access to basic needs. The orange area shows you what would happen if in 2018, a pre-COVID year, you provided the poorest people with the minimum needed for living a dignified life. 3 bulbs in a refrigerator, for example. And then if they get a little bit more to escape from poverty, what would be the impact? And that's the pink area. And basically for climate change, you will see that if you meet the minimum needs of people worldwide, that's a 26% increase in our current emissions. Now you might then say there are too many poor people, and I will just come back and say that emission of the poorest is equivalent to the emission of the top 1 to 4%. So it's really the top 1 to 4% that is the big inequality problem. All right, so I'm not going to go into great details, but here on the left you see the 2018 results, and on the right you see the 2050 results. And basically the green area shows you if there is a theoretical corridor. So if you kept the just boundary and you met the minimum needs, are you within the corridor? And you can see in 2050 we do not even have a corridor, which basically means we really have to change the way we all live. So the narrative is that we are the yellow ball, the red story is the safe boundary, most likely the blue, the just boundary, is a little bit more stringent. If you want to meet the minimum needs, you have the dotted line in between. And essentially what we are talking about is redistributing the rights to resources and sinks. And that is linked to our justice framework on ends and means. Okay, let me move to climate change. So on the x-axis we have time, y-axis greenhouse gas emissions, and our greenhouse gas emissions must get to 0. And this means that in 1990, the amount of emissions you could emit was much higher. And as you move towards 2030 or 2040, the amount of emissions you can share between countries is shrinking massively. And that basically means that there is conflict between countries as to who has the right to emit greenhouse gases and who doesn't. And this also could mean that countries will walk out of the system because they don't want to reduce their emissions. So essentially, it was much easier to solve the problem 35 years ago and come to an agreement than to try to solve the problem now. And this makes the justice issue even bigger, because right now we have, I think, more than 3,000 cases worldwide where people are suing governments or private sector to get justice in the area of climate change. Now, of course, technology can do some help here, because we could replace our fossil fuels and we could try to get to net zero, but these are challenging issues. The biggest north-south issue here is that initially we thought there was an inverted U curve, which meant that as you got richer, you would emit more, but beyond a point you would be so rich you would be able to disconnect your emissions from your GDP. But we now know that we have an inverted, an N-shaped curve, which basically means that industrialized countries have to get to 0 and developing countries have to get to 0. And it's not that developing countries can start to behave like industrialized countries before they get to 0. That would be a really big problem, and they would get completely locked in. And this is a story that neither rich countries want to hear, because their technologies are not suitable for the global south, nor do poor countries want to hear this, because they want to become as rich as New York. So this is a big north-south challenge, or even a rich-poor challenge. The other big challenge is that if we had planned in 1990, we could have come through made a nice phase out. What we have done instead is every 4 years with new governments, we have postponed action. And now we have reached a point that it's almost impossible for us to stay within the 1.5 degree boundary, which would require us to phase out fossil fuel almost by 2030, or pretty fast. And that basically means that if you were to do it fast, that in itself would be massively unjust. And that is a reason why a lot of people worldwide are now saying climate change does not exist as a problem. So let me come to my set of injustices. The first injustice is, even though we knew before 1990 that up to 1 degree it is green, between 1 and 2 degrees it's orange, and beyond 2 degrees it is red. There were publications. Even though we knew that, we delayed the adoption of the target till 2015, losing valuable time. The second injustice is, if you don't have a budget, how do you share it between countries? So therefore, it was not really shared. And this basically means that from a principled approach, we have moved in 2015 to a voluntary approach. And if you add it all up, we are moving towards a 2.7 degree world at least. But actually, I think we're moving to a much higher world, and I'll show you why later. Third, if you look at the fossil fuel that we have on Earth, it's valued between 16 trillion and 300 trillion US dollars, depending on how much you count and what you count. Even you also count the aircrafts, and you count how many years into the future. It's a lot of money. Global GDP is 110 trillion dollars. So who is running the Earth? It's essentially the fossil fuel companies. And that makes it very complicated. But there is also a stranded asset story about developing countries, which I'll show you in another slide. If you look at mitigation is reducing our emissions. Our primary instrument for reducing emissions has been market-based mechanisms. It has not been a policy mix which includes a range of different issues. And this means that we have ended up with an efficient reduction, but it's not equitable and it's not effective. I can explain if needed. And then we talk about adaptation. Well, there's right now every hour a $15 million price somebody is paying for the impacts of climate change. And we are seeing lives lost, and there's very little real money going for these issues. And finally, very few people are actually discussing the driving factors, which are our definition of development, our financial system, our legal system, our economic system, and the instruments that promote inequality. So these are the multiplication of justice issues. I picked two slides from other people's work. This one shows you that the darker the red, the more the per capita emissions in 2019. And over here, the darker the red, the greater the vulnerability of countries. So you can see there is a very clear north-south, and we could have also done this in terms of rich and poor people, because rich people tend to be living in areas that are less vulnerable and poor people are more exposed. So, climate politics is a classical north-south issues because of the average differences in emissions, because most impacts happening right now are because of the past emissions of the developed world. If emissions are to be kept within safe limits or just limits, well, just limits are passed, but safe limits, then we should end very quickly, and then there is no space for developing country growth. And then, of course, the impacts tend to be much more severe on an existential basis, maybe not in a dollar basis in the global south. Now, I was studying you about stranded assets. This particular map made by a colleague of mine shows you the lifetime of coal mines. Now, if the coal mine is white in color, that means its life is coming to an end. If the coal mine is dark red in color, that means it has a long life. And what you will see basically is that in Southeast Asia and South Asia, we have a large number of coal mines that have been very recently opened and have a long life ahead. So closing down these mines is going to be a very, very complex, just transition issue for labor. And we have to figure this out. And a pity, I also have slides where I can show you who is actually investing in the fossil fuel in the global south. For example, in South Africa, most of them are people from the global north. So that's also a problem because a lot of the money goes back to the global north. If you look at the oil and gas company strategies, they knew about these issues in the 1950s. Their first strategy was denial, cast doubt, climate change is barely noticeable, question the science, blame the scientists, lobby very heavily. The oil companies have a huge lobby budget. And of course, there's something called revolving door, which means that senior officials of the oil and gas companies join the European Union or the US government and vice versa. And we have at least 71 cases in the European Union of 5 companies between 2015 and 2071 of revolving door. And then you see a slight change towards delay. We are necessary, we are inevitable, you need us. Renewable energy cannot replace us. Or you see greenwashing where they don't always tell us the truth. Or you see techno-optimism, that is, don't worry, we will manage with carbon capture and storage, we will maintain the status quo. And more recently, there's also strategic blame displacement. I've heard several companies say, for example, oh, but it's the consumer. The consumer wants fossil fuel, it's not us. We're just providing it, we're just doing a service. So basically trying to shift the blame to the consumer. In any case, if you look at the bigger picture, what you are basically seeing is that the big banks, the pension funds, the insurance companies, they're the ones that are really investing still in fossil fuels in other parts of the world. And the fossil fuel companies themselves are resisting change. And this slide is trying to come up with some ways in which we could deal with climate justice using the same Earth system justice approach. So if I can just draw your attention to the bottom half where we are operationalizing, you can see that we are talking about making sure that everybody on Earth has access to minimum needs, which might have a fossil component, but we think it's very important that that should not be through fossil because it will lock these countries in. We also have what we call the just no significant harm level. The no significant harm principle is very important in almost every single culture in the world, as well as in international law. But it was put aside in 1992 when the Climate Convention was being adopted. And I think this is a very important point. The next one is liability and collective insurance, responsibilities, and how do we share the remaining carbon budget. Now, very recently there has been a judgment, it's an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, and they come up with that 1.5 degrees is the legally binding target of the climate regime based on their interpretation of the entire documents. They also say that all nations, whether you have ratified or not, have a responsibility to prevent significant harm. And I was jumping up and down to hear the word significant harm because that was the missing component. That all countries must have their all ratifying countries must make sure that their nationally determined commitments are progressively becoming stronger and together add up to 1.5. And that if a state fails to take action on closing down fossil fuel, that may constitute an international wrongful act. Basically, the justice story very simply is we cannot cause harm to others. So whatever we do is okay as long as we don't directly or indirectly cause harm to others. And that is why we are trying to figure out what is this climate justice story. When I'm doing my research, I've come up with 4 dominant narratives and 4 counter narratives. Small governments, small companies, small households say my emissions don't matter, but every emission counts. Sometimes you find a city like Amsterdam saying I'm spending my money well, I'm a donut city, but they don't tell you that they're earning most of their money from fossil fuel because Amsterdam has one of the biggest ports in the world on fossil fuel. And also they have big shares in Schiphol Airport. So it's very important that there's consistency between income and expenditure. Some of them say my emissions are so large, I can't do much without going bankrupt or losing votes. etc. But they probably have the critical mass for change. And some say, why should I take action because others aren't? And this is very important to take scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions into account. Scope 3 emissions are the emissions of the entire value chain that feed into your system. So let me broaden the story back again. I started with the limits. So whether you look at metals and minerals, basically it's declining in quantity. If you look at land and fresh water, it's also declining in quantity in terms of good quality land and good quality fresh water. And if you look at the biosphere, that's also declining. So we are facing a declining ecosystem, but our demand is going up. We have a lot of fossil fuel, and we should not be using that fossil fuel. So essentially, we are talking about limits. And the question is, how do we deal with limits? So in the rational actor model, the neoliberal capitalist will have markets, pricing, privatization, and trade. And a lot of this is undertaken through confidential contracts and arbitration. Then you have the hegemonic group, which says my country first. They want to avoid multilateralism. They focus on sovereignty and securitization. And this has very prominently been the case in the area of water, but now also we are seeing it in other areas. And then we have Elinor Ostrom's polycentric approach, multiple actors, multiple approaches, and the need for self-management and experimentation. I believe that we have come to a situation where neither the neoliberal capitalist nor the hegemonic, nor the polycentric approach will be able to solve the world's environmental problems for us. And I think what we need is what Oren Young calls a social practice model. We need to move towards a global constitution focused on transformative justice with goals, principles, and roles. Now, if you look at the history of civilizations collapse normally because of climate change or the collapse of the natural system, inequality and external factors. If you look at empires and regime collapse, they too have a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is environment, climate, and water. And I think that you can preempt such a collapse through a focus much more on a constitution, which focuses on human rights, relationship with nature, protecting health, science-based policies, etc. So what we are doing right now is we've started a project to try to develop a bottom-up constitution. We're inviting essays from anybody and everybody above the age of 10, but if you are a minor, your parents must approve of the submission. And we have 3 PhDs that are going to look at different aspects of a global constitution, whether it's private and public law or the role of technology, whether AI is going to actually hamper or help, and inequality and environmental issues. And we're going to do consultations. So I would like to issue an open invitation to all of you and to those of you online and your students and your children, your neighbors. If you can send us a 1,000-word essay or a poem or an artwork, as long as it's photocopyable, in any language that can be translated with AI, then we will be happy to include you as a contributing author to the bottom-up global constitution. You can send it directly to me, or you can send it to our website, and we will be very happy to take all the ideas about what you think is important for the world. And with that, I'd like to thank the European Research Council for its finances and the National Science Foundation and the Earth Commission. Many thanks.